This is Damon Fordham, adjunct professor of history at Charleston Southern University and the Citadel, and I'm here to tell you today a very fascinating and somewhat bizarre story of race and confusion. Whenever I go back to my hometown of Spartanburg, South Carolina, I like to go to the county library, and in the Kennedy Room archives there are a lot of fascinating old newspaper articles and old books and old stories of the city's history that I like to go there and collect from time to time whenever I'm up there. I'll do that in between visiting relatives and speaking engagements there. And one of the stories I found some time ago happened in the Spartanburg Herald newspaper on September the 5th, 1911. They had a headline that said, "Negro arrested for passing as white man." And here's how it goes. There was a gentleman out of Greensboro, North Carolina, by the name of Mr. C.M. Love, who came to Spartanburg, and he had what they called a swarthy complexion in those days, which meant that he would be racially somewhat ambiguous, so to speak, right? So he stayed in this boarding house with this well-to-do family in Spartanburg, and he originally worked in sawmills and such. But anyway, in September of 1911, he went out one evening and he fell in love with this beautiful light-skinned black lady. Well, the light-skinned black lady refused his attentions because she said she did not date white men. He said, "I'm not a white man, I'm actually a Negro," language at the time. Well, so later on that evening, he got into a violent quarrel with the black boyfriend of the said light-skinned black lady. So he wound up getting locked up in jail because he was also drunk when he was fighting for the affections of the said light-skinned black lady. Now, while he was in jail and drunk, he told them that he was an African American and he wound up in the jail cell with other black people. But they found that his address was this white boarding house, and they're like, "Wait a minute, hold up, what's going on here?" And so C.M. Love confessed that whenever he was around white people, he let them think he was white. But whenever he was around black people, he told them that he was a Negro. Okay, well, as it turned out in Spartanburg, that was against the law. And the mayor at the time, Mayor Lee, I believe his name was, he actually had this guy sentenced to $3.50 in 5 days for being drunk, and $100 for being a black man passing as white, and he was also cited for disorderly conduct because it was illegal for a black person to sit at a dining room table and eat with white people. Really, folks? Oh, and it gets even better. And after the trial, he confessed to the reporter of the Spartanburg Herald that two of his grandparents were full-blooded white people, while another set of his grandparents were actually Native American Indians. Really, folks? So, as you see, that story was a grand mess of confusion. And it's really sad that people would actually spend their energy on putting a case like this through court. Why? Well, let's think about it for a minute, okay? Prior to the advent of the age of exploration, as the Europeans were sailing around the world to get the natural resources of the rest of the planet, very seldom did people ever discuss the idea of race. If you lived in the Mediterranean area around where Asia, Europe, and Africa sort of interconnected, people would be familiar with those who were of different skin tones than them. But for the most part, the average person in those days seldom went beyond 20 miles from where they were born. So race was not really an issue. In those days, people discriminated against each other based on gender, social class, religion, tribe, and nationality. Race was just simply not an issue at this point in human history. But when you had the advent of the transatlantic slave trade and the conquering of different nations, they had to have a system to convince the masses of people that doing this was okay. So they told the ignorant masses of that time, and the majority of the people in those days were ignorant by our standards, that these other groups of people who they were enslaving and colonizing were lower on the scale of humanity, that they didn't have feelings, they were less intelligent, so that this was okay. This became crystallized and given authority in the 1700s, in part due to the work of a scientist by the name of Carolus Linnaeus, man from Sweden. In 1735, he wrote a book called the Systema Naturae, which is Latin for the system of nature, where, to make a very long story short, he broke up mankind into 5 different categories. And to save time, I'm just going to talk about 2 of them. He said that the highest on the human chain was what he called Homo Europaeus, in other words, the European man. And that the European man was the smartest and the most intelligent and the most beautifully featured of all of these. And he went on down to list the Native American Indians, the Asians, and the others, and so forth, until he got down to what he called Homo Afer, in other words, African man, which he said was on the lowest level of humanity, whose thoughts were basically ruled by emotion and were basically one step away from beasts, in essence. And so people like this gave scientific authority to the ideas of racism, but the problem with that was that then as now, this was junk science. And of course, with the masses of people not knowing very much about science, and this guy was considering to have authority as a scientist, many people fell for this type of thing, and it made a bad situation worse with race conflict as time went on. Now, what's really tragic about all of this is that most people today should know that the whole concept of race is an artificial one. Because after all, in America, for example, Italians were not considered white until about roughly 100 or so years ago in the early 1900s. And there's always confusion about the identity of people who are quote-unquote Hispanic. Most intelligent people know that quote Hispanics are really has to deal with ethnicity more so than race. Any person of any race could be Hispanic, but in either case, though, the sad point of it is that people like that giving authority to such things has caused so much energy to be wasted in human history over things that are essentially nonsense. Now, if C.M. Love, for example, if he went to jail for being drunk or fighting the guy over the lady, that's one thing, but to $100 fine just because he passed as a white man, really? So, by diverting so much attention to things like that in recent human history, imagine how farther humanity could be if they could concentrate on things that are far more productive and constructive. And with that being said, this is Damon Fordham.